Welcome to the Business Case for Racial Equity. I'm Angela Glover Blackwell, CEO of PolicyLink. And PolicyLink is a national research and action institute working to build a fully inclusive society by advancing policies that improve outcomes for low-income people and communities of color. We draw our inspiration from the innovative work that's happening all across the country, where local leaders working with community residents are coming up with the strategies that are needed. When we talk about building this fully inclusive society, we walk ourselves right into one of the biggest conundrums for the nation, and that is the problem of equity, inequality as it relates to equity, and race at the center of all of those challenges. And so when we talk about equity and building an inclusive society, improving outcomes for low-income people and communities of color, we know that we are talking about the issue of race. We're talking about racial equity. One of the things that often happens is when people hear about the problems of inequality and the need to promote racial equity, they think that that is a challenge for government, a challenge for public policy, a challenge for philanthropy, a challenge for NGOs. And while it is also a tremendous opportunity for business. And business is an essential actor, an essential partner in trying to achieve racial equity, build a fully inclusive society, improve outcomes for low-income people and communities of color. It's an opportunity that is really going untapped. Not because some people aren't working on it, but is not the driver for business. Business has not made it a top priority. And I believe that there's not only an opportunity to do that, it's become essential. We live in the United States. We live in a nation in which the majority of people very soon are going to be people of color by 2044. Since the summer of 2012, the majority of all children born in this country are of color, and by 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. By the end of this decade, by the end of 2019, that's tomorrow, the majority of all children 18 and under will be of color. So as we think about the problem that Michael Porter lifted up yesterday in terms of inequality, and we look at the shifting demographic, it's clear that we have to do two things. Every entity and institution has to begin to try to do something to reduce inequality because it is making it very difficult to maintain prosperity and to promote growth. And we have to do something about racial inequity because the very people who are being left behind will determine the fate of the nation. That when we think about everything that is important to us, including prosperous businesses, it's dependent on entrepreneurs and producers and consumers and leaders. And the people who have the potential to be that are going to be people of color. Therefore, this racial equity agenda has to be addressed. And in thinking about how to address it, it takes more than goodwill. It has to be deliberate. And it has to be deliberate not only about the actions that we take today, but understanding how we got into this situation. The classic for that is this. Where you live in the United States of America is a proxy for opportunity. Where you live determines everything. Access to schools, jobs, transit. It even determines how long you live and how well you live while you live. It's based because in the way that we have developed in our nation through something called redlining. Redlining made it impossible for Black people in particular, but also for Latino people and Asian people to be able to live in places where there were opportunity because it was a business practice not to make loans so that neighborhoods could become integrated. So you couldn't get a loan if you were trying to move into a neighborhood that was white. And it was a government practice to endorse that. FHA loans could not go to promote integration. That was a long time ago, but we are still feeling the effects of it today. People are living in communities where the schools are failing them, where there's no good transit system, where there's lack of investment. It's because of historical racism that continues in terms of impact, and we know that we have persistent and continuous racism now. So we've got to be deliberate. We have to understand the past, and we have to understand that we won't solve this just by having diverse workforce. We need to do that, but we need to think about the products and services. We need to think about the public policy stances so we don't ever repeat the kind of thing that happened with redlining. And we need to understand that doing this is going to be good for the bottom line. It's where prosperity is going to lie for the present and into the future. On your seat, you have something called the curb cut effect. It's an article which I want you to read at your leisure. But the point that it makes is that like those curb cuts in the sidewalk that are there because of the advocacy with people with disabilities, but promote benefits for everyone, pushing a stroller, pulling a wagon. It even saves lives because it orients people to cross at the corner. Just like those curb cuts, there are things all across society, from seat belts to no smoking to the GI Bill, that focusing on the most vulnerable, doing it strategically, cascades benefits to all. The same will be true in your business. And that's why we're going to spend this time talking about the business case for racial equity.
Thank you. That was beautifully said. And you can see why we're so pleased at FSG to be working with Angela and PolicyLink to undertake a project we're calling the Corporate Racial Equity Advantage. And it is a shared value approach to the role of corporations in promoting racial equity. Doing this, again, not just for the benefit of society, but for the benefit of companies and their business. And you know, we've already talked about this indirectly yesterday. When Village Capital got up and said there are new business opportunities in venture capital because the traditional venture capital model, which is a bunch of white men talking to each other, has left out an awful lot of this country. And only 1% of founders of new ventures are people of color that get venture capital backing. And they said there's a whole business opportunity for the rest of America and the ideas they have for enterprise. And we talked about it yesterday when we heard Deshaun stand up and talk about his experience at the Gap and the opportunity it's created for him, but also the opportunity it's created for the Gap in tapping into a new workforce and creating a better motivated, more engaged, and more knowledgeable workforce for their stores, which turns directly into better sales outcomes and better profits. So it's not a new concept for us, and it's also not a domestic US concept alone, because whichever country you come from, there are marginalized populations. And your business models, like ours, have been developed to serve the mainstream and the affluent. And there are business opportunities, both in hiring and selling, to find ways to modify the conventional business practices that you're used to meet the needs and the opportunities of the marginalized populations in your countries. And so it's great pleasure to have with us today this panel. Next to me is Latha Reddy, who is the Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility at Prudential, also President of the Foundation. We talked a little bit about impact investing yesterday, and it's interesting that Prudential has committed to create a $1 billion impact investing portfolio by 2020. And next to Latha is Tyler Spalding, who's the Senior Manager in Corporate Affairs at PayPal. And as he will describe, PayPal is actually committing to become a purpose-driven company. So without wasting time, we wanted to give them a chance to share their stories with you, because each of them is doing something really interesting that is a shared value initiative to create a competitive advantage by focusing in on issues of racial equity. So with that, let me ask Latha to tell a story.
Great, thank you, Mark and Angela, and good morning, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here to talk about a topic, well, I guess two topics that Prudential is quite passionate about: shared value and racial equity. Just by way of context, you probably all know Prudential is a global financial services firm. We were founded over 140 years ago in Newark, New Jersey, which is where we remain headquartered. We, over the years, have kind of streamlined our business to focus across three core businesses. One is insurance, which is how we were founded. Retirement services and asset management rounded out. And then, of course, like all of us across all sectors and industries, right, we have the core corporate functions of human resources and marketing and communications and so on. And I say that to say, right, we look at all of those platforms as levers that we can pull to advance racial equity. And we have some core things that we're doing across all of those, which if they come up later, we can talk about. But the story I'm going to share is one that exemplifies, I think, again, how we think about advancing racial equity through shared value. And it is using the policy and advocacy lever and our thought leadership capabilities. And the topic is retirement, or more specifically, the retirement crisis that we have here in America. So, you know, we're in a world that is living longer, younger, and faster. And the implications of that are that many of us are at risk of outliving our assets in retirement. We all probably, right, take for granted the fact that we benefit from workplace-based retirement plans. We can contribute in, our companies match them, right, and they're growing exponentially over time, and we have other savings vehicles and tax-advantaged vehicles, right, that we can take advantage of. The reality is that almost 50% of Americans, working Americans, do not have access to workplace-based plans, which means that almost 40% of Americans are at risk of outliving their assets in the later years. The stark reality, right, is that the people most at risk, right, are people of color, women, people in low-wage jobs, and part-time workers, because they tend to make up the majority of the workforce of small businesses. And small businesses are the least likely to offer workplace-based plans. So to help address this coverage gap, Prudential over the last several years has taken a lead role in advocating for changes to federal legislation that would allow for open multiple employer plans, or MEPs as they're called. And MEPs are single retirement plans that are utilized by 2 or more employers. And you know, what that would do is enable, well, right now MEPs are allowable, right? They've been in place for decades under federal tax law. But they're a closed sort of entity, meaning only like businesses can group together to create a plan. And so think about trade associations and other affinity groups, right, that can enable them, allow their members to do that. So what we're trying to do is open it up to a full range of businesses, including and especially small businesses. And so that would enable, right, employees of small businesses to have the same benefits that we all have, right, and access professionally managed plans that offer a variety of options to them that are appropriate for them. So over the last, again, several years, we've been, you know, advocating for this and have built a coalition, and it's a pretty broad-based coalition, and we even have a point of view on what a model plan could look like, right? It's things like automatic enrollment, auto-escalation, building in, you know, a lifetime income solution as part of the fund and investment offerings in these plans. And obviously, right, there's a huge business play here. The more employers that want to offer retirement plans, the more business there is for companies like Prudential that have retirement services that we provide to employers. Clearly a societal benefit, right? As I said, we all know the statistics, right? The people who will be most positively impacted by this are people of color and women and other groups that have been underserved for decades, for, you know, more than that. And so we see this as a huge opportunity for us to, again, right, drive shared value. Clear win for us, clear win for society. And so we are, you know, holding the line on this and encouraging others to join us in this effort. And again, there's broad-based bipartisan support. The legislation has not been passed yet. It was passed out of committee last year, and we're hoping it'll be reintroduced into the new Congress at some point this year. The timing's unclear, but we will continue to move that forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Latha. And sure, let's. It's a great shared value example. Tyler, tell us what's going on in PayPal.
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Mark, and thank you to the FSG team for including us in this conversation and for welcoming PayPal here. I hope everyone is somewhat familiar with PayPal. We are almost 2 decades old. We, like Lada at Prudential, have a lot of different aspects of our business. We are a dual-sided network. We derive most of our business serving merchants around the world, but we also provide, and increasingly so, consumer financial services to individuals around the world. And we're a platform company. We there's the PayPal product that all of you are very familiar with. Probably also Venmo is a part of our platform that some of you are familiar with, Braintree, which is a merchant payments processing platform. So there are a lot of different assets that we have at our disposal, one of which is also PayPal Credit. There is a consumer-facing version of PayPal Credit, but the story I'm going to talk about today is the credit that we provide for entrepreneurs and small businesses. I think since 2008, I think everyone is pretty familiar that there has been a financial services crisis. Especially since the Great Recession, and that has been particularly acute and acutely felt by small businesses, especially so here in the US. Credit, that is a critical enabler for entrepreneurs and small businesses to build and grow their enterprises, has all but dried up and has been increasingly expensive to service on the part of traditional financial institutions. And I think the impact of that is, specifically felt by entrepreneurs of color and small business owners of kind of all backgrounds. So in 2013, after listening to a lot of the merchants that we serve, and really kind of understanding some of their needs and trying to understand what more PayPal could do to help enable them to grow, we heard very clearly that there was this credit gap and that they were really hoping that PayPal could come in and help fill that gap a bit more. And so we piloted a program called PayPal Working Capital, which the model itself is quite interesting. We leverage PayPal proprietary data instead of traditional credit scores to be able to make these credit and lending decisions to our small businesses. And that's based primarily off of PayPal sales history and PayPal transactions. And we are able to evaluate creditworthiness using our own data and also drilling deep into understanding what a small business looks like, what industry or sector are they in, how do they compare across their peers. We have millions upon millions of merchants that we can compare businesses across, and really, even if they don't have a really thick credit portfolio in the traditional sense, we still have a very high degree of confidence in their abilities to pay back those loans. And the loans are fixed fee, no interest. The fee is determined based off of the size of the loan, and then they're paid back as a percentage of each PayPal transaction going forward. So if the small business goes a day without processing a PayPal transaction, they actually aren't penalized for that. And the model itself is quite interesting, and I could rattle on for a while about the alternative lending model that we have piloted here. But I think in 2015, rather, we looked back at the first full year that we had been delivering this new product to entrepreneurs and small businesses in the US. And we had a hunch that it was driving some really interesting social impact. It was certainly driving a lot of positive business results. Our merchants were able to grow and conduct more transactions through the PayPal platform. But we wanted to better understand the social impact side of it. And we determined that about 25% of the loan recipients here in the US in the first full year were in the 3% of counties that experienced 10 or more bank branches leaving since 2008. So we were able to credibly say that we were providing access to finance to entrepreneurs and small businesses in banking deserts. But what's even cooler, in my mind, and most kind of relevant for this conversation, is that over 30% of those entrepreneurs and small businesses were in low to moderate income communities. So we don't track race or ethnicity or some of those demographic details for the entrepreneurs and small businesses themselves, but we're able to use zip codes as a proxy for understanding the backgrounds of those entrepreneurs and small businesses. And I think that's a really incredibly important figure that over 30% of those loans are going to those communities. And frankly, that we are able to level the playing field for entrepreneurs and small businesses of all backgrounds. The last thing I'll say is Of those entrepreneurs and small businesses who were in those 25% of, or in those counties that had experienced 10 or more bank branches leaving, they experienced dramatic business growth as compared to their peers who didn't receive this funding. They grew on average about 22% year over year after receiving their working capital loan. Their peers who were not online and who were not receiving this access to capital were growing at about 1.7%. So we're providing economic opportunity, we're providing access to capital, and we know that when we do that and we provide that opportunity, it trickles down to job creation and prosperity and community development in pretty exciting and tangible ways.
And just to add, it's not a small program. How
It's
big
not a
has it
small
become?
program. We actually just announced, so since 2013, we have provided $3 billion with a B, dollars worth of loans. Loans here in the US, in the UK, it's cash advances, and it's scaled to the UK and Australia, and we've served more than 115,000 entrepreneurs.
Oh, yes. Terrific examples. Really want to make me jump up and cheer. These are exactly what we're looking for. And I'm curious how these ideas originated, because there are a lot of companies that are perhaps thinking they should be focusing on racial equity, but how do you get it going, and how do you do the problem solving and the nuancing to fruition? Both of you.
Well, one of the things that I think is really most interesting about PayPal Working Capital is that it was solving for a business need. And it was driven by the PayPal credit team. And they were saying, we need to find ways to better serve the small businesses that make up our community. And we're lucky in that it has had this kind of great positive externality. And now we're saying, how can we be more intentional about the way that we drive some of that social impact? It's certainly driving business impact, and in a way that is not abusive of entrepreneurs and small businesses. We are not charging crazy high interest rates or taking crazy high fees. We benefit when the small businesses grow. They're able to conduct more transactions using PayPal. They're able to process more volume. They're able to sell more. And that's when we benefit. And so that we were solving for a business need, but then we looked back and said, wow, we think we have some really interesting social impact stuff here, and we did, and now we're kind of taking those insights and carrying them forward into the future design and iteration of that program, and frankly also other programs to better serve our merchant community and also individuals. There's a lot of stuff that I can talk about on the individual side too, but I think for this conversation, what we're doing for our merchant community is quite interesting. And
Terrific.
Yeah.
Lata?
So, at Prudential, we were actually founded on the premise of shared value. So founded over 140 years ago to provide insurance for working families at a time when they didn't have access to those types of products. So our founder saw an opportunity to create a business solution to a societal need, right? That was a class inequity, not a racial inequity, obviously, but that ethos has remained part of our DNA throughout our history. And so there are examples of how we've lived out that purpose along the way. But this recent example that I shared about retirement, right, that was driven by our retirement business. So I might be, right, I'm the head of CSR, I'm here representing Prudential in this conversation about shared value, but shared value existed long before I came to the company, and so it didn't begin with us and it won't end with us. But we see a role, right, an important role right now, given the extremes in inequality that we're seeing, right, and the extremes in racial inequity. I see a role for us and my team to help drive our purpose forward and continue to innovate and think about new and creative ways to advance equity.
Your examples just so make the point that I was making earlier about where the growth opportunities are going to be. When you ask, well, how does a business keep expanding? Where's it going to come from? Then you've got to figure out, and what are the needs? What are the experiences? Clearly, in both examples, you have moved beyond the diversity through HR to look at policy, to look at the business practices. Is this a hard transition to make in companies to begin to think about racial equity beyond hiring?
For us it hasn't, and we're somewhat unique in the sense that, as I mentioned, we're still headquartered in Newark, New Jersey, right? a community that's gone through extreme highs and lows and has been, underinvested and disinvested for the last 40 years. So, as a company that sits in the heart of that city and has been fiercely loyal and committed to this city throughout our history, we've long recognized that our capital can and should do more than just generate profits for the firm, right? We need to help drive progress. It's the original charter of business, as we know. So while we've always been focused on representation within our company at all levels, we've also realized that as an asset owner, a capital provider, there are other ways that we can think about advancing equity by deploying our resources in ways that have a very positive impact beyond what they do just for the firm.
Yeah, I would say, I think, it's interesting being a Bay Area tech company where the conversation does naturally, and I would say also rightfully so in a lot of instances, focus on the hiring and HR practices of, tech firms. I think there is more that can be done on the part of companies like PayPal to embed these commitments more fully into the product too. We have a stated company value of inclusion, and it drives a lot of our programming, a lot of our partnerships, and certainly our hiring practices. But I would say, the humility point earlier is definitely one that we take seriously, and we believe we're doing some interesting things, but that we have more to do, and also that these issues are interconnected and interrelated. If we're trying to serve the broadest community of small businesses possible, the people who make up our workforce should also represent those communities and be bringing forward their insights into the product development or into the business strategy or the corporate development. And so it's not to say we shouldn't be doing HR and diversity practices internally, but it should also be rounded out through everything else that we do.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I come up against a lot of companies that even on the HR side are not doing nearly as much as they should and have excuses for why they're not. But listening to you, it's clear that once you realize where it is you have to go, and then you understand the relationship between who's on staff to how to be able to do that effectively and authentically, it becomes a very iterative process. It's very interesting. What kind of challenges have you come up against, if any? I'm sure there probably have been some in being able to do this work, to do it authentically and to stick with it until you can get to some measurable outcomes.
Yeah, I would say there's always kind of not the challenge, but the opportunity to continue to prove out the business value. And that's kind of the path that we're on right now. And I think we are lucky to have believers in our executive team, and we have a CEO and leadership team who are themselves very purpose-driven and who are themselves champions of these values and are really committed to embedding it into the core of the business. But I think at all levels of the company, continuing to have that conversation about why it's so important and the value that it's generating for the company across all different types of metrics and indicators is just something that we continue to have to do.
I would say very similar story, right? To demonstrate that this isn't a distraction, right? That this is in fact how you create long-term value for your stakeholders. And so, the sort of paraphrase, I think Inder Nooyi from Pepsi said this, but in essence that, right, CSR or purpose, whatever you want to call it, isn't about how you spend the money you make, it's about how you make your money. And helping people understand that we need to be concerned about the societal implications of all the decisions we're making, right? So alongside the financial considerations, let's think about how we're impacting the world and move forward.
I see questions are coming up. I'm going to turn to you in a minute, Mark. But I just wanted to probe whether or not you are, and if you are, is it hard to actually talk about racial equity? To actually say those words or words similar to it. I get that the business is moving here because that's where business is, but is there self-consciousness?
I feel like we've been pretty fortunate at Prudential. But there are ways to do it, right? So part of my job is to figure out how to translate that. And so we talk about purpose, right? Prudential's purpose, and it is founded and rooted in our belief that everybody should have the opportunity to be financially secure, right? And so we're trying to power the ambitions of people and communities to achieve financial security. And underneath that, right, we talk about the need to advance equity, because we won't get there, right? We won't be able to fulfill our purpose if we don't talk about the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, right, and other forms of inequity. So that's how we get to it. And when people hear it that way, right, they understand. They think about the American dream, right? And the notion that if you work hard, right, you should have the ability to be secure and achieve your dreams.
Yeah, I would say not resistance, but just continued cultivation and training, and just frankly more opportunities to say, to learn about how to talk about and how to address these conversations as a team. We had a really interesting culture building moment 2 years ago rather, when we separated from eBay. We are now a publicly traded independent company, but for many years we were a part of eBay. And we had that moment of saying, who are we and who do we want to stand for in this next chapter of PayPal? And we kind of defined the values, we defined the mission and vision, all of that stuff. And I think it's maintaining focus on that and the clarity of thought of what we're trying to achieve, but also always circling back and having those conversations. And it's not necessarily resistance, it's more continuing to have and cultivate those conversations, some of them tough, inside of the company, and building up building a culture where we really value those types of conversations and that type of introspection.
That's terrific. And please, we have some questions that have already come in. Please use the Slido app and SV Leaders to send us questions or to vote on questions that have already been raised. And the first question that's popped up is, are you facing pushback from shareholders who don't see the business value of these initiatives? And of course, these are public companies, and we've heard a lot about the pressure for short-term results. And how do you handle that? How do you address that?
So we have not had any issues. We're quite transparent, and in fact, the company every year gives us the prime real estate in our proxy statement. So we get the front inside cover where we talk about our shared value initiatives. And so we did that again this year, and we just had our annual meeting yesterday, actually. And for 5 years in a row since I've been back at the firm, we have not had any issues about people, asking the company, why are you spending your money in this way?
Yeah, we have not either. In fact, we've received some questions from shareholders, from stakeholders around, can you be doing more? Which is also great. And I think, that's a great opportunity to lean into. We've also been fortunate to be doing really well as a business. And I like to believe and do strongly believe that it's that is due in no small part to the fact that we just really do have this sense of shared purpose. We have this sense of values that are driving our work forward, and that is a really important part of our business strategy and how we are able to get results.
That's terrific. One of the questions is about language, and I don't see it here anymore, but the question was, is there a challenge using the equity language with your leadership? It's one thing to talk about economic opportunity, new business opportunity, but is there a sense of discomfort in actually using the language of equity?
So, again, I think as a company that prides itself on being purpose-built and purpose-driven, we're able to talk about equity with everybody, with our C-suite leadership and with our associates across the firm, and people understand that that's part of fulfilling our purpose.
Yeah, I would say we don't necessarily use that term, but I think we talk about the themes and a lot of the values that are baked into that term. I think, again, I think we are pretty early in in some of our initiatives in this space, and we're excited by some of the things that we've been able to do so far, but we know we have more to do. And I do think starting to more fully embrace some of that language is important, although I do think, the semantics of it don't particularly matter quite so much as long as the spirit of it is there. I think making this relevant to the culture and to our specific company and saying, how do we embrace the spirit of this in a way that feels authentically and genuinely PayPal is also a really important part of this.
That's great. There were a couple of quick follow-on questions for you, Tyler, about whether PayPal, you're doing this in 3 countries. Do you have plans to expand it internationally beyond that?
Plans for sure, and hopefully you'll follow along as we continue to go on this ride. But I think we're really excited that we've been able to scale it, internationally as much as we already have, and stay tuned for more soon.
Okay,
Could
great.
I ask a follow-up on that? Internationally, where you've already spread, do you think that the focus is still on communities that tend to be more marginalized?
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that we're doing is replicating some of that research that I talked about before in those other global markets to understand, are we having those same types of results in those other markets, and where can we be, tweaking the model or doing other wraparound services or other types of things to be driving even more of that impact going forward. So, in the UK, we're starting to study now that we have a good volume of loans or cash advances rather that we've made in that market, looking at where those are going, who they're serving, what they're enabling those merchants to do, and we expect that they will be quite similar, if not even maybe a little bit better, since we will have learned from what we did in the U.S.
And I'll just emphasize that a second and build on it, because this business of doing the research and really understanding the market that you're trying to serve is one of the dimensions of shared value that's often not there in thinking about equity, diversity, social impact more broadly. And it really is like any other business issue. You've got to understand the market, you've got to understand the needs, you have to develop a product that meets those needs if it's going to succeed. And that sort of reality-based intervention isn't always present in other areas, and is one of the sort of essential elements of shared value that is part of, I think, why we give it its power. But there was a question for Angela, which was, what will it take to get other companies like these on board?
I'm hoping that being able to lift up what works, which is the tagline for PolicyLink, lifting up what works, will be the way that this will spread. Having examples like these, finding new examples. The work that we're doing with FSG on the Corporate Racial Equity Advantage really intends to focus on finding these models all across the country and beginning to create some networks among groups who are doing this work so they can be supported and learn from each other, so that corporations really begin to feel that this is where the fields are going in which they're working. This is where business is going. So creating a buzz, lifting up examples, creating networks, and celebrating people who are doing good for business and doing good for the nation and doing good for the world.
And let me just take that opportunity to create a plug that we are writing a report with PolicyLink on this Corporate Racial Equity Advantage, and we're trying to use this as a launching point for creating community of practice of organizations, companies that want to learn from each other how to do this work better. And there is an email at corporateequityadvantage@fsg.org. If you have ideas, comments, if you want to participate and be involved, just send an email or talk to any of us from FSG, and we'll be happy to bring you and your organization into this work. So let's go back to the questions from the audience. Michael Porter and I talk about shared value as competitive advantage. And one of the questions asks, how do your companies stack up against competitors? Are you really seeing that there's competitive advantage in doing this work? Latha?
So, yeah, how do we stack up? I think I'm biased, obviously, but even on worst days, I think I would say this, that I think we're a little further out there than other financial services or mainstream financial services firms, and it's for probably one primary reason. Brian Stevenson talks about proximity, right? Being proximate to people and the issues and the reality right on the ground. Again, as a company that's headquartered in a community like Newark, right? We are that. And so we are, we're part of the fabric of that community, for better or for worse for the community. I mean, for us, we think it's always been for the better. But, we were there, right, when the civil unrest happened in the late 60s. And we chose to stay when others fled. But not only did we choose to stay, right, we made an affirmative decision to take a leadership role in that community and behave as an anchor in the community, as we were, and drive progress forward. And so, I think that distinguishes us a bit from because the other firms, right, whether you're literally situated on Wall Street or not, right, there's a distance that's created that allows people to be a little more detached. And we've seen that play out in different ways. And, I know we all have our own priorities and so on, but when you think about what people really need, right, access to capital, and you talked about the, Village Capital example of the lack of venture capital in diverse entrepreneurs and so on. People we see are much more comfortable funding technical assistance, right, to help businesses versus giving business owners the capital they need to grow, right? We saw this when it came to recapitalizing minority banks. We have one of the largest African-American banks sitting in Newark, headquartered there. And, like all the other banks, struggled during the downturn, right? We're trying to recapitalize, revitalize, and provide the really critical services that they provide to the Newark community. They were looking for 1 million, 2 million, no more than 5 million from all the financial institutions. Nobody stepped up, right? People talk about financial inclusion, talk about access, but people were too afraid to, so it's something we need to work on, and we're not perfect by any means. Obviously, we've got a lot to learn and a lot to do that, we're not currently doing, but I think by sharing more examples and understanding what the real risks are versus the perceived risks and so on, and understanding that, it's going to take all of us to move the needle on this.
Yeah. Tyler?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say we have started to publish our diversity figures on an annual basis, and you can find those on our website, and I think a lot of tech companies are. And I think it's fair to say the whole tech industry as a whole, needs to step up and, take an industry orientation toward this work. And we again think that we're putting into place some really important programs that are demonstrating, not just talking about these values or putting them up on our walls or our campuses or whatever, but are actually demonstrating our commitment to this through the programs and partnerships and engagements that we are undertaking across all parts of our business. And I'm sitting here and I'm loving that Village Capital has been raised, because we are Village Capital's global fintech partner for all of their programming. And so there again, I think that it just makes me think about how interconnected and interrelated all of this is. We can be driving social impact programs, but we can also be embedding commitments to equity in those, and that can be a driver for attracting the talent that we want to be having and the impact that we want to be having as a company, and what we want to be saying, PayPal stands for, and what we stand to do going forward. And that systems mindset, I think, as we think about this work, is really important.
Lata, let me ask you a question. Your work is really in the policy realm, trying to shift policy to make these employment, retirement savings, multi-employer plans available more broadly. We had an interesting panel at the end of the day yesterday on media and politics and shared value. The political environment right now is quite different, and there's actually efforts to oppose some of the policy efforts you're making. How are you responding, and how is Prudential responding in this political environment?
So, like all corporations, right, trying to assess the lay of the land, and as we know, things shift and move pretty much daily. And so working with our external affairs team, government relations, and understanding, it's an interesting calculus now, right? Because what in theory is good for could be good for corporate America if the tax rates, right, are reduced, if infrastructure, gets passed, and so there are things that are happening over here that may not, right, be good for the rest of the world. So the corporate tax rate goes down, the price of capital for community development escalates, right, goes up tremendously. And so we're on both sides of that equation. So how do we think about the whole? So that to me is the most important conversation for us right now, is how do we think about maintaining our values, right, living our values in this era of uncertainty and
That's, yeah, good answer. Tyler, if you can answer that, but there's also a specific question about why does PayPal not track racial and ethnic demographics? Is that intentional, or is that just?
Yeah, it is intentional. I mean, we don't want to be making any discriminatory lending decisions, and so we just it's not something that we ask our merchants, or even when they're being onboarded, not something that we are even taking in. So we use other proxies like zip code data to try and get at some of that understanding of who they are. And certainly, I mean, we have relationship managers for all of our merchants who really know them very well. So it's not necessarily a mystery to those people. But as a factor for decision making around lending, it's not something that we are incorporating.
Very interesting. There's a question about whether there's opportunity to scale these initiatives further. It sounds like there is. I'm also curious, are there other things in the works? I mean, these are great programs because you can already talk about the measurable business benefit. I'm curious if there are other ideas in development or in the works you can talk about that aren't there yet in terms of measurable business impact, but are interesting opportunities you're exploring.
Sure. So we have an initiative that's been underway for a couple of years now, but I think the business benefits will be a little longer to manifest. And it's focused on opportunity youth. So we are working with Youth Build, right, a global nonprofit that takes young people who are not formally employed or in school and trains them in the construction trades and some other industries as well. Prudential has a real estate investment business that has a tremendous platform in the form of some of the world's largest developers, right, that they work with, that are their partners, and then in turn the contractors that those developers work with. So we are working together to create a faster glide path to employment for the young people coming out of the Youth Build programs. And in the early days, we've already had 10 of the development partners. From one year it was 1, and then the next year it was 10 who raised their hands and said, we want to get involved with the local Youth Build affiliate and hire some of the young people. And so now about 10 or 11 young people have been hired. And so we are looking to see how, so talk about scale, right? Their platform is tremendous because they've got hundreds of partners around the world. So we believe that we really can bring this to scale. Right now we're in the US and in Mexico. And we are using a third-party evaluator to actually do a formative and summative evaluation of the social and business impact of this program.
Wonderful. Tyler?
One of the things that we're starting to think about is, the community piece of this and how important community is, and peers, and facilitating some of those relationships. It's one thing to kind of provide the financing and then just go, and it's another to say, what training can we offer, or what other merchants can we put you in touch with for you to learn about and build a community of best practice, and to train each other and to learn from each other, or what other wraparound services can we offer, not required, but offer for merchants who would like to take advantage of them. And as they are at these inflection moments of taking in capital and building and growing their businesses, what more can we do to be a partner and to connect them with like-minded partners that will enable and facilitate their growth over the long term?
Great. Angela, I'm going to give you a minute to have the last word, but I just want to say I think these are great examples of, Michael and I talk about shared value as being a source of innovation. And most businesses go through their activities sort of with blinders on. They're doing what they've conventionally done for decades, what their competitors are doing. And the whole opportunity for business that shared value creates is to say, look in the places that you haven't looked before. Look in the places where your competitors are not looking. Look to serve populations that have not been well served by the conventional business models we have today. Figure out how to change the constraints in your hiring and other resources that limit the ability of your company to grow. And I think these are just marvelous examples of the kind of business opportunity that comes from innovation through shared value. Angela?
There's not much I can add to that. I was smiling because I had 2 more questions and I saw 18 seconds, so I knew I had to let those go. I'm so inspired by you and by the way you tell your story, and I just hope that you all enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. It gives me great hope that we really can make racial equity in business have the same goal and really achieve the outcome that we need for both. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Peter Seligman, who is the chairman and founder and CEO of Conservation International. I have to say I'm looking forward to his remarks quite a bit. I had the chance to sit next to Peter at dinner last night, and he had to excuse himself early. And I said, too bad, why? And he said, well, President Trump asked me for a 2-page memo on why he should not leave Paris Climate Accord. So we said, get out of here, go, right, work.